Although the drug cartels operating today have existed for only a few decades, they have their roots in a long history of drug smuggling in the Americas. Smugglers and law enforcement evolved together in this cat-and-mouse game, which began when the old world collided with the new. In the early colonies, import taxes were a major source of government income, but they were almost impossible to collect. The main smuggled drugs of the time were tea, tobacco, rum, and the molasses that were used to make it. The birth of the United States was partially triggered by British attempts to clamp down on these trades, which led to riots and the infamous Boston Tea Party. Now, at the same time, the British were illegally smuggling opium from their Indian colonies into China, and they even waged 2 wars to keep the trade going. This was probably around the same time that we earned our reputation for irony. But it also indirectly created the Mexican drug trade, when Chinese immigrants introduced opium poppies to Sinaloa state. They begin to feed an unregulated US market, where you could literally buy heroin out of a catalogue, visit a hash parlor, and drink Coca-Cola that actually contained cocaine. But during the early 1900s, these drugs become linked to crime and racist stereotypes, and are outlawed along with alcohol. Smuggling becomes rampant, especially rum from British colonies. The Colonial Secretary at the time calls the law an affront to the whole history of mankind. The harder enforcement increases traffic in harder drugs, which are easier to smuggle and more profitable, overtaking alcohol after Prohibition ends. The US goes to war in 1941, and they look south for reliable supplies of opium to produce medical morphine and hemp for ropes and parachutes. Cultivation skyrockets in response. But after the war, the US pushes drug prohibition internationally. Mexico launches its first military eradication program, while Peru outlaws cocaine, sending the indigenous coca industry underground. Chilean processors rebuild the trade by trafficking to Cuba, a haven for drugs, gambling, and prostitution since Prohibition. It's wildly popular in Havana during the 50s, but in '59, most organized criminals flee Castro's revolution to the US, bringing the trade with them. The culture changes dramatically in the 60s when marijuana and heroin become relatively mainstream. Soon, Mexican producers can barely meet the growing demand.
America's public enemy number 1 in the United States is drug abuse.
President Nixon retaliates with the war on drugs in '71, tightening the border and pressuring Mexico to spray plantations from the air. Americans become terrified of being poisoned by tainted joints, and they turn to Colombian weed, smuggled in via the Caribbean. The remaining Mexican traffickers survive by forming the Guadalajara and Gulf cartels. Cocaine begins to be seen as glamorous and safe, and production rises in Bolivia and Peru. But in '73, the major Chilean traffickers are arrested by US-backed dictator General Pinochet. The new Colombian traffickers move in on the trade, and they soon organize into their own cartels. Miami becomes the main entry point for cocaine, and soon the Colombians force out the early Cuban traffickers. The resulting turf wars around Florida brings them to the attention of the police, but it's the rise of crack cocaine and its association with crime and minorities which triggers a national panic.
Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children.
In response, President Reagan launches a series of offensives against smuggling in the Caribbean. The cartels shift to routes through Central America, where the US is forced to turn a blind eye to its regional Cold War allies, who are profiting from the trade. The Gulf and Guadalajara cartels handle the final journey through the US border, but in 1985, the murder of a DEA agent leads to a crackdown, and the Guadalajara cartel splinters into regional groups in '89. In 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union allows the US to turn its full attention to the drug war, and they begin arming and funding cocaine eradication in Peru and Bolivia. They also assist the Colombian police in making major arrests. Pablo Escobar is killed in 1993, and the cartels are mostly dismantled by the mid-90s. However, cocaine production has relocated from Peru and Bolivia into the Colombian jungles, where it becomes entangled in a guerrilla war between the government and leftist groups. Back in Mexico, an economic crisis causes unemployment, while border flows quadruple under NAFTA. This sets the stage for Mexican cartels to increase recruitment and smuggling. Soon, they fill the vacuum left by the Colombians, becoming the dominant traffickers in the Americas. The laws of supply and demand have locked governments into a global game of whack-a-mole. When the hammer comes down, it only creates a vacuum for new traffickers and producers. And through this process of Darwinian selection, each generation becomes more organised and ruthless. History repeats itself. And even as the drug war rages, it's clear that the drug trade always finds a way.